at the beginning, can you explain us what is balkanization of internet as a concept?
Sure, it's the idea that different parts of the world regulate the internet very differently, and as a result of that you get different types of internet in different parts of the world. So rather than one global internet, you have different internets in China, in Russia, in Africa, in Europe, and they all have different rules, and they're difficult to be connected. And if this happens, the difficulty or the problem for human beings is that they will basically be split into different internets. And the great thing about the internet, that right now you can read somebody's blog, whether they're in China or in Russia or in Africa or in Europe, from anywhere in the world, will become more difficult. That's what people are scared of.
Yeah, but even if big institutions decide to go in that direction, is it really possible on a technical level?
On a technical level, anything is possible. On a practical level, it's difficult to see to what extent this will actually happen in a real life setting. I also think that the people are scared of balkanization, use it as an excuse to say everything needs to continue the way it's going right now. And many excuses are then used to protect the interests of either large American companies or of certain specific interests around the world which would like to prevent, for example, specific regulation or protection of data in Europe, specific attempts to ensure ability to access, let's say, strong cryptography, or specific attempts to ensure that human beings can be sure that their data is well protected when they're used by government services.
And then if you go in another direction, talk more about the content, because we have some problems with public regulation, and we believe that maybe private regulation would be better. What is your opinion? What is better approach when we talk about the content?
So if you're talking about regulating internet content in general, the default approach should be do so carefully, regardless whether it's public or private. And different actors have different pros and cons. With the public regulation, it's slow, but if it's done well, it has the ability to be accountable, it can be transparent, and there's a fair process that can be achieved. And there's a very high standard of accountability, of due process, things that we know from public administrations and institutions if they're done well. Of course, the question is then in which areas should that even be done in the first place? And so it needs to be within constitutional bounds, following international standards and applying the rule of law. And the difficulty is that none of these basic legal principles apply to the private sector. So if they filter out information, if they change things, they're essentially changing them in a way that influences how we see the world. And we have no control over that. It's not accountable, it's not transparent. There's basically no legal basis. The private sector will just do what they want. And even though they now produce transparency reports, it's not the same level of transparency as you could expect from a public agency, from a court, from any kind of government institution, again, a well-run government institution. And so it really depends where you are in the world, what sort of quality of governance you have there, and what sort of private sector actors are being engaged. They both have their pros and cons. If I was to talk about, we're in Austria right now, if I was to talk about Austria, the obvious choice would be a public sector actor should be the only one that should be regulating internet content.
What we are facing today is that both public and private regulators want to automatize their processes, and they are getting into something what's very, very famous these days, like algorithmic governance. Can you explain us what is algorithmic governance and show some examples?
So basically what it means is that we right now have situations where previously a human being would make a decision. For example, in Poland, if you want to be recommended for a certain job when you're unemployed and like looking for work, previously human beings would tell you this job is good for you, or this job is good for you, or this job is good for you. Now you fill out a form and you're automatically told which jobs fit to you by a computer. This is very excellent research that has been done by Panopticon Foundation, and they show this quite elegantly. And it's one of the examples where in the public sector, we are, as human beings, governed by algorithms. Another example is related to online dating. There you have an automated system which will tell you which partner is correct for you or which date you should be going on. And there the scary thing is that in order to test whether the algorithm actually works, one of the online dating platforms, OkCupid, they tested on their users different types of algorithms without telling their users beforehand to see whether the algorithm was working or not. And from a scientific point, it makes sense to test and see whether your algorithm works. From a scientific point, you should always also have the consent of the people you're testing things on before you test them on them. And so essentially this automated system, which is supposed to help you find better dates than just asking somebody or taking a random person, actually sent people on bad dates that they knew were bad dates to see whether the dates would be bad. So these are just two examples from private and public sector about how automated decisions that used to be made by human beings are now being made by computers. And the challenge of that is that there are, so far at least, relatively few legislative acts or government mechanisms that allow for individuals to be able to have control over this. And this is both the case for public sector automation and the case for private sector automation. There's a very low degree of transparency, there's almost no accountability, and there's a situation for individuals where they would like to know a lot more in many cases, especially when they experience negative effects, but they don't have control over that themselves. They don't have the ability to understand what's going on, not just because they lack the technical expertise, but because they're not provided with basic information about the decisions that are being made.